He never expected anything like this to happen in his life. He was living a simple routine, waking up early, working long hours, and coming home tired but content. His world was small and predictable. He paid his bills on time, kept his head down, and stayed away from drama. Land ownership, legal disputes, and powerful neighborhood groups were things he only heard about in online stories. He never imagined becoming part of one. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It looked official, the kind people usually open with worry. At first, he thought it might be a tax issue or a mistake from a bank. He placed it on the table and let it sit there while he made coffee. When he finally opened it, he had to read the first page twice. Then a third time. It was about an inheritance. The letter explained that a distant relative had passed away months earlier. Someone he barely remembered from childhood visits and family gatherings. They had lived quietly, rarely calling, rarely visiting. According to the document, this relative owned a large amount of land, and after debts and paperwork, it had all been passed to him as the closest remaining family member. The number didn't feel real at first. 1,500 acres. He stared at the page, waiting for it to make sense. He had never owned more than a small yard behind his house. He didn't even know how big an acre really was. The idea that someone had left him forests, open land, and old access roads felt unreal. Like a mistake someone would soon correct. Over the next few days, more letters arrived. Maps, legal notices, tax records. Everything matched. The land was real, and it was now legally his. At first, he felt more confused than happy. He wondered what he was supposed to do with so much land. Selling it crossed his mind, but something about that felt rushed. He decided to visit the property before making any choices. The land was several hours away. As he drove, the scenery slowly changed. Busy streets turned into quiet roads. Stores became fewer. Cell service weakened. When he finally reached the area marked on the map, he pulled over and stepped out of the car. The land stretched farther than he could see. Trees stood tall and still. Dirt roads cut through open fields. There were signs of life, but no noise. It felt peaceful, almost forgotten by time. Then he noticed something odd. There were fences. Not old ones either. Some looked recently repaired. Signs were posted along the roads. They warned about private property, community rules, and fines for trespassing. One sign mentioned an HOA that confused him. According to his documents, this land was not part of any community. Yet here were clear signs that someone believed it was. As he drove further in, he saw houses in the distance. A neat neighborhood sat along the edge of the land. Clean roads, trimmed lawns, decorative gates. Everything looked organized and controlled. Later that evening, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end sounded firm, practiced, and annoyed. The caller introduced herself as a representative of the local Homeowners Association. She spoke quickly, as if reading from a script. She said she had received notice about changes in land ownership and needed to clarify expectations. She told him that the land surrounding the community belonged to the HOA and that his presence there earlier that day had been noticed. She warned him about community rules and said he would need permission before entering their property again. He calmly explained that he had inherited the land and that official records listed him as the owner. There was a short pause on the line. Then her tone changed. She laughed. Not kindly. She said records could be wrong. She said the community had existed for years and that the land had always been under their control. She suggested he stop making claims that could cause problems. When the call ended, he sat quietly for a long time. He wasn't angry yet. He was curious. Over the next week, he reviewed every document again. Deeds, surveys, old maps. The land had been in his relative's name for decades. Long before the neighborhood existed, there was no mention of any transfer to an HOA. Still, letters started arriving. The HOA sent notices claiming unauthorized access. They mentioned fines. They claimed maintenance costs. One letter even demanded payment for road use. Each notice was worded confidently, as if there were no doubt they were in charge. He decided to visit the county records office. The clerk there was calm and helpful. She pulled up old records and showed him faded documents scanned into the system. The boundaries were clear. The land belonged to his family, passed down through legal channels. The neighborhood had been built later, right next to it. The clerk frowned when he mentioned the HOA's claims. She said this wasn't the first time. She had heard complaints about them. That was the moment he realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had been acting like an owner without being one back at home. He received another call from the same HOA representative. This time, she was sharper. She told him the community would not recognize his claim. She warned him about legal action if he continued to interfere. He listened quietly and said only one thing. He said he would be verifying everything through official channels. That didn't sit well with her. Within days, neighbors from the community began watching his visits. Some looked confused. Others looked nervous. A few avoided eye contact entirely. It was clear that many of them believed what the HOA had told them for years. He didn't blame the homeowners. Most of them probably trusted the people in charge. They paid their fees, followed the rules, and assumed everything was legal. But the more he looked into it, the more questions appeared. Why were HOA signs placed so far beyond the neighborhood boundary? Why were access roads built on land never transferred to them? Why were people being charged fees for land they didn't own? These questions didn't feel small anymore. He hired a local attorney, not for revenge, but for clarity. He wanted facts, not conflict. The attorney reviewed the documents and confirmed what the records already showed. The land was his. No shared ownership. No easements. No agreements. The attorney suggested a professional survey. That idea stuck with him. A survey would show everything. Clear lines. No opinions. No power games. Just truth measured on the ground. When word of the survey request reached the HOA, their reaction was immediate. Emails came fast and angry. They warned that surveys were disruptive. They claimed it would harm community peace. They tried to delay it with complaints and objections. That resistance only confirmed his suspicions. He approved the survey as survey stakes began appearing along the land. Tension filled the air. The HOA leadership demanded meetings. They accused him of creating chaos. They spoke loudly about tradition, control, and authority. He said very little. He knew this was only the beginning. What started as a quiet inheritance had turned into something much larger. Not because he wanted a fight, but because someone else had been living in one for years. Unchecked, as he stood near the edge of the land one evening, watching the sun drop behind the trees, he felt a mix of calm and resolve. Whatever happened next would not be based on anger. It would be based on truth. And the truth, buried for years under signs and fences, was finally coming to the surface. After confirming the land was legally his, he thought maybe things would calm down. He imagined visiting, maybe walking the trails, exploring the open fields, and thinking about what he could do with so much space. He didn't want conflict. He wanted understanding. But the HOA had a different plan. It started small at first. Another letter arrived, stamped, typed, insisting that he stop entering the property. They said he was in violation of community rules. Even though the area they referred to had never belonged to anyone except his family, he read it slowly, trying to understand how someone could make these claims so confidently. Then came another notice. This one added fines. Large fines. Hundreds of dollars for using roads that his inheritance clearly included. The wording was precise, almost bureaucratic. They made it sound official, but when he checked, there was no legal basis. Just a claim. He tried to speak with the HOA politely. He called the office, explained his situation, and even offered to provide copies of the legal documents. The receptionist listened, then passed the call to someone who introduced herself as the HOA president. She spoke quickly, as if she had rehearsed this line dozens of times before. She told him the community had always maintained the land, and that his ownership was irrelevant to current rules. He stayed calm. He thanked her and ended the call. But the intimidation didn't stop there. The next week, he drove out to the land again. He wanted to see it for himself, to walk the roads, and check the fences. As he approached, he noticed fresh tire tracks on the dirt roads. Some led directly into areas clearly marked on his maps as his property. Others crisscrossed through his fields. Signs had been moved. Fences had been repaired or, in some cases, rebuilt entirely without his permission. A few neighbors stood along the roadside, watching him closely. They waved politely, but there was curiosity in their eyes. Some whispered to one another, probably discussing what he was doing there. Others looked uneasy. He guessed most of them had trusted the HOA for years, paying dues and following rules that might not have applied to them at all. One afternoon, while he was examining a line of old fence posts that marked his boundary, a young man approached. He introduced himself as someone who lived on the edge of the community. He said he had heard about the inheritance and wanted to ask a question. Do you really own all this?" he asked, gesturing broadly toward the rolling fields, patches of forest, and winding roads. "Yes," he replied. "The surveys and deeds confirm it. Every inch is part of the inheritance." The man nodded slowly, as if trying to wrap his mind around it. I never knew," he admitted. "I thought the HOA. You know that they had this land. They've told us for years that it's community property." He listened quietly. This was the problem in its purest form. People believed what they were told. They trusted authority without checking the facts. And now, that misplaced trust was causing confusion, frustration, and hostility. He spent the day walking the edges of his property. He measured stakes, marked trees, and took photographs. Every step felt like reclaiming something that had been forgotten for too long. Back home, more letters arrived. This time, they were urgent. The HOA claimed he had been interfering with community operations and warned that legal action would be taken if he continued visiting. He read the words calmly. He had anticipated this. He had documents. He had maps. And he had the patience to let facts speak louder than threats. He decided to respond methodically. He drafted letters, attached copies of the inheritance documents, and explained the boundaries as verified by the county. Every time he sent something, the HOA responded with increasing irritation. Their tone shifted from polite warnings to pointed demands. They insisted that the community's long-standing claims mattered more than the official records he presented. It became clear that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. They were used to controlling the narrative, influencing neighbors, and claiming land without verification. Now, someone was challenging that authority, and they didn't know how to handle it. Meanwhile, neighbors started asking questions. Small, tentative questions. A woman at the local grocery store mentioned she had seen him walking the land and wondered if it really belonged to him. A man at a gas station asked if he had plans to build on it. Each interaction reminded him that the community had lived in a bubble of misinformation for years. He wasn't trying to be dramatic or confrontational. He simply wanted the truth to be understood. The situation escalated further when one afternoon, as he drove along one of the access roads, he noticed a group of HOA board members inspecting the area. They were pointing, taking photographs, and talking in low voices. When they saw him, one waved. Another gave a sharp nod. It was obvious they were monitoring him. Every visit he made, every inspection he conducted, was being watched. He didn't let it intimidate him. Instead, he documented it. He wrote down the dates, times, and who he saw. He took photographs. Every small action added evidence to his side of the story. At home that evening, he reviewed the notes and maps. He realized the HOA had been systematically using the property for years. Roads, walking trails, and even small storage areas had been placed on land that was never theirs. The more he looked, the more clear it became. This was not just about a few fences. This was about long-standing control, a network of influence that depended on neighbors' ignorance. He knew patience was crucial. He didn't want to escalate through confrontation. He wanted the facts to speak. He wanted the legal truth to be undeniable. To prepare, he reached out to a professional surveyor. He explained the situation and asked for a full boundary survey of the property. The surveyor agreed, noting that with proper documentation, the lines would be officially marked, and any disputes could be resolved definitively. When the HOA learned about the survey request, the letters became more frantic. They warned that surveys were disruptive, that they would interfere with the community, and demanded meetings to discuss it. He responded politely, saying that it was his right as the property owner to confirm boundaries. The community started to murmur. Some homeowners expressed curiosity. Others were visibly uncomfortable. The tension grew because for decades the HOA had relied on assumptions, not facts. Now, facts were coming. During one visit, he ran into a neighbor whose house bordered the land. The neighbor admitted he had always paid fees for land he didn't actually own. He had trusted the HOA. When shown copies of deeds and maps, he looked stunned. "I can't believe it," the neighbor whispered. "All this time," he nodded. "It's not your fault. The information was misleading. But it's true. This is your land too if it touches the boundary. The HOA can't claim what doesn't belong to them." The realization spread slowly. People began talking quietly among themselves. A few more neighbors approached him over the next weeks. They asked questions. They admitted doubts. They wanted confirmation. Through all of this, he remained calm. He didn't make threats. He didn't post online rants. He focused on clarity, documentation, and patience. Every letter, every visit, every conversation built a stronger foundation for the truth. At night, he reflected on how strange this whole situation was. He had inherited land unexpectedly. He had stumbled into a dispute with a powerful group. Yet, he felt oddly in control. Not because he had legal documents, but because he understood what the HOA didn't. The truth matters more than authority. And patience can expose long-standing errors more effectively than anger ever could by the end of the part. The story wasn't just about property anymore. It was about power, trust, and the consequences of unchecked control. The HOA had assumed everyone believed them, but now a quiet, measured challenge had begun. A challenge grounded in facts, not confrontation, and the next step was coming: the survey, which would show once and for all where the boundaries lay, and whether the HOA could continue its claims or had to face reality the day the surveyors arrived. The tension in the air was almost tangible. He had met with them early in the morning, handing over every deed, map, and old record he had. The surveyors were professional, calm, and precise. They didn't take sides. Their job was simple: measure, mark, and document. What they would find, the law would accept. He watched as the crew unloaded their equipment: tripods, measuring tools, and GPS devices. They moved efficiently, setting points along the edge of the property and discussing coordinates quietly. He could feel the weight of the moment settle in. This was it. Everything he had been preparing for. Every document, every conversation, every careful visit, it was all leading to this. As the survey began, the HOA noticed immediately. Within hours, he received frantic phone calls and emails. They demanded to know what was happening on community property and threatened legal consequences if the survey continued. He replied only once, politely but firmly, that he was exercising his legal rights as the property owner. When he arrived at the property the next day, he noticed HOA representatives standing near the fence line. They had binoculars, cameras, and a mix of expressions: anger, confusion, and panic. For years they had assumed this land was theirs by default. Now someone was proving otherwise. The surveyors moved along the boundaries with methodical precision. They marked stakes at every corner, measured the distances between trees and old fences, and carefully compared their readings to the old maps. Every calculation confirmed what he had suspected. Much of what the HOA had claimed for years, including roads, trails, and small plots, was on his property. He walked along the edge of the survey lines, feeling a mixture of awe and vindication. The land looked different when someone officially marked it. Stakes poked up from the earth, stakes that symbolized truth. They didn't belong to the HOA, they belonged to him. Neighbors began to notice. Some approached cautiously, clearly curious but afraid of the HOA's wrath. A few admitted that they had paid fees for land that wasn't theirs, believing the HOA's story. One elderly man shook his head and whispered, "I should have known something wasn't right all these years." The surveyors worked for several days. Each day the tension grew. The HOA tried more desperate measures, calling the survey company, claiming harassment, insisting the work be stopped. The surveyors, experienced and professional, ignored the intimidation. They were there to record facts, not participate in politics. By the third day, the surveyors had uncovered more than he expected. Some roads and parking areas used by the community had been placed on his land for decades. Trails meant for walking or community events crossed property lines. Even a small storage lot the HOA claimed as community property was entirely on his acreage. Every detail they documented was another piece of evidence that the HOA's claims had been false. At the same time, he began to notice changes in the HOA's behavior. Their communications became sharper, defensive, almost panicked. They called for meetings, sent letters warning homeowners about legal complications, and tried to argue that long-term use gave them some kind of right. But the survey made it impossible to argue. Numbers, measurements, and official boundaries could not be disputed. One afternoon, while the surveyors were taking readings near a corner where a small walking trail intersected his property, an HOA board member approached him. She was flustered, her usual composed tone gone. It can't be right," she said. "This is part of the community. People have used it for years. You can't just claim it." He listened calmly. "The survey shows the legal boundaries," he replied. "Everything here is documented. The land was inherited. I didn't take it from anyone." Her face twisted with frustration. She tried to argue about tradition, use, and perception. He didn't respond beyond stating the facts. He didn't need to. The survey, the maps, and the stakes spoke louder than words. Neighbors, drawn by the unusual activity, began stopping by. They asked questions, looked at the markers, and even took photos. Some admitted relief they had suspected something was off. Others were angry, upset at being misled for so long. It became clear that the HOA's power had relied entirely on people believing their claims without checking. Now, that belief was crumbling. By the final day of the survey, the boundaries were clearly marked. The land he had inherited stretched wide and uninterrupted. The HOA's influence, at least over the land itself, was gone. Where they had once placed signs, built fences, or claimed rights, now there were stakes, flags, and lines that left no doubt. He walked slowly along the newly surveyed edge, taking in the view. The forest, the open fields, the winding dirt roads all were his by law. But more than that, the survey had revealed a truth about human behavior. Power often relied on perception. People assumed authority, and communities accepted it, sometimes for decades. But truth, measured and documented, could undo even the most entrenched control. The HOA, of course, didn't give up immediately. They tried to argue with homeowners, saying the survey was disruptive or unofficial. They held meetings, sent letters, and tried to sway opinion. But the survey was official, conducted by licensed professionals, and filed with the county. There was no argument to make. Some homeowners finally began to speak out. They asked questions about fees they had paid, about access they had been denied, and about the legal basis of HOA authority. The community was divided, but the facts were on his side, and the survey had made those facts impossible to ignore. During this time, he also realized something important. He didn't need to fight. He didn't need revenge or drama. The survey, the patience, and the calm approach had done what anger never could. By documenting the truth, by standing firm and measured, he had shifted the balance. Authority based on assumptions and intimidation couldn't withstand evidence. The surveyors finished their work and submitted their report. Every measurement, every boundary, every stake was recorded officially. Copies went to the county, his attorney, and him. The document was unassailable that evening. As he walked along the newly verified edge of his property, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He wasn't celebrating. He didn't need to. But he felt relief. Relief that the truth was documented, that the land was secure, that the HOA could no longer claim it without facing undeniable evidence. Neighbors began approaching more openly. Some admitted they had doubted the HOA's claims all along, but were afraid to speak up. Others simply wanted clarity. The community was slowly realizing that the rules they had followed for years were based on claims, not law. Meanwhile, the HOA leadership grew increasingly frantic. They began consulting lawyers, exploring options to challenge the survey, and holding emergency meetings. But the evidence was clear. The measurements were official. Their decades-long assumption of ownership was collapsing. Through all of this, he remained calm and patient. He didn't post on social media. He didn't confront the board in anger. He focused on the facts, the documentation, and the boundaries clearly marked by professionals. Every visit, every letter, every stake in the ground strengthened his position. By the end of the week, the situation was undeniable. The land he had inherited was officially his. Roads, trails, and areas the HOA had claimed were now recognized as part of his property. The HOA's claims had no legal basis. He realized something else too. The survey had done more than mark land. It had exposed the HOA's overreach, the reliance on fear and assumption, and the power of truth measured carefully and presented calmly. Authority that depends on misinformation cannot stand when confronted with facts. As the sun set over the forested edge of his property, he stood quietly, reflecting. This was only the beginning. Legal action, refunds, and community adjustments would come later. But for now, he had won something far more important: clarity, legitimacy, and a foundation built on truth. For decades, this land had been quietly used, claimed, and controlled by others. Now, the surveyor's work had revealed what had always been his, and that, he realized, was worth more than any conflict or confrontation. After the survey was completed and officially recorded, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed. At first, it was subtle. Homeowners whispered to one another, questioning old rules and wondering how long the HOA had been wrong. Some looked relieved, others frustrated. The board of the HOA, however, was visibly unsettled. Their confident tone had faltered, replaced with meetings, frantic phone calls, and emails that grew more urgent each day. The new owner knew the survey had done its work, but he also understood that facts alone wouldn't immediately change behavior. People had trusted the HOA for decades, and those assumptions didn't vanish overnight. Still, he felt calm. He had the law, documentation, and professional measurements on his side. It was a matter of letting events unfold in a controlled way. The first major sign of consequences came when a homeowner walked up to him during one of his visits. She had lived near the property line for years and had faithfully paid fees she believed were required. Her expression was conflicted, part embarrassment, part relief. I didn't know, she said softly. I thought all of this was part of the HOA. We paid every year, and I never questioned it. He nodded. You're not alone. Most people didn't realize the truth was hidden behind signs and assumptions. She looked down at her shoes, then back at the stakes marking the survey lines. Does this mean we get refunds? Or do we have to pay more? He shook his head. I'm not here to take money from anyone. The survey shows who owns the land. That's it. How fees or payments are handled will be decided separately, and I'll let the law guide that. Word of the survey began to spread. Small groups of neighbors came by during weekends, curious to see what had been revealed. Some were skeptical at first, convinced the HOA still had control. Others brought old letters and notices they had received over the years, looking for guidance. The documents he had carefully preserved became a resource for them. The HOA reacted with increasing desperation. Their emails grew longer and more threatening. They demanded explanations, claimed irregularities in the survey, and suggested homeowners were being misled. For a brief moment, it seemed like the community might split, some siding with the HOA out of fear or loyalty, others recognizing the truth. One afternoon, he met a small group of homeowners at the edge of the property. They asked questions, comparing the survey stakes with old maps they had kept. It became apparent that the HOA had been collecting fees and asserting ownership over parcels that had never belonged to them. People were shocked, but grateful to have clarity at the same time. The HOA tried to maintain authority by calling emergency meetings. They claimed the survey was flawed and tried to intimidate homeowners into compliance. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, filled with dense legal language and warnings about disruptive actions and violations of community trust. They even suggested that he was acting recklessly by walking the land. He remained calm. He didn't respond with threats or anger. Instead, he encouraged homeowners to review the survey, check official county records, and think critically. His approach was quiet but effective. Facts are harder to ignore than fear. The HOA's most aggressive leader began to crack under pressure. Board members argued privately, some questioning how they could have been so wrong. Others worried about liability, refunds, and legal consequences. For years, they had relied on the assumption that nobody would challenge them. Now that assumption had been shattered. Legal notices began arriving from attorneys representing homeowners. Questions were raised about fees paid for land that was never owned by the HOA. Some residents requested partial refunds, while others simply sought acknowledgement of their rights. The board tried to respond defensively, but the survey had made the truth clear. They couldn't argue measurements, coordinates, or official property lines. As the days passed, he focused on practical matters. He walked the edges of the property, ensuring the stakes remained visible. He photographed boundaries and recorded interactions with neighbors. Every detail reinforced the legitimacy of his ownership. He also began to notice a shift in the HOA's communication style. Threats and demands were replaced with increasingly nervous inquiries. They sought advice from lawyers, but many questions could not be answered without admitting past mistakes. The long-standing control they had exercised over the land was now impossible to defend. Homeowners began to act more independently. Some removed HOA signs that had been placed incorrectly. Others requested formal acknowledgement from the HOA that certain parts of the land did not belong to the community. Even those who had once blindly followed the board began to see that assumptions had caused confusion and tension. During this period, he also realized the importance of patience. There was no rush to escalate conflict. By allowing homeowners to process the information, review records, and witness the survey lines firsthand, he strengthened relationships rather than creating adversaries. The truth had a way of fostering clarity without anger. One day, an older couple who had lived near the property for decades approached him. They had quietly suspected something was off, but hadn't spoken up. "We always wondered," the man said, "but we didn't want to cause trouble. Now we see what you've discovered. Thank you for showing us the truth." He smiled gently. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone knowing what's real and fair. That's what matters." Small victories continued to emerge. Some homeowners asked for official documentation to update their records. Others clarified boundaries on their own, reducing friction and confusion. It became apparent that the survey had a ripple effect. It didn't just establish his property rights, it corrected years of misinformation. The HOA leadership struggled to regain control. They issued more letters, some threatening lawsuits, others attempting to discredit the surveyors. But the evidence was undeniable. Coordinates, stakes, and official filings could not be ignored. Homeowners began asking why the board had not verified ownership sooner and demanded transparency moving forward. Through it all, he maintained a consistent approach. He didn't insult or antagonize. He answered questions calmly and let the facts speak. That measured response made the contrast with the HOA's panic even more evident. People saw the difference between fear-driven authority and lawful clarity. One particularly tense moment came when the aggressive board member tried to block access to a dirt road that crossed a section of his property. He simply showed the survey stakes and legal documentation. The board member hesitated, realizing that any confrontation would not hold up in court. She walked away, muttering under her breath. Frustrated but powerless, neighbors continued to watch the unfolding events with curiosity and relief. Some approached him to ask practical questions about using the land. while others sought advice on how to protect their own property from similar misunderstandings. His calm, factual approach made him a point of trust in the community. By the end of the month, it was clear that the HOA's authority over his land had collapsed. Their letters, threats, and claims no longer carried weight. Homeowners began openly questioning past fees and practices. Even those loyal to the board had to accept the reality confirmed by surveyors, records, and official filings. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not triumph or gloating, just relief. He had inherited something remarkable, and instead of reacting with anger or haste, he had allowed facts, patience, and professionalism to settle the matter. The HOA's overreach was exposed, and the community began to adjust to a new, clearer understanding. He continued to walk the property, noting improvements that could be made and areas that could be preserved. The land was more than legal boundaries. It was part of the local history, part of people's lives, and a symbol of clarity triumphing over assumptions. The legal process had started. Homeowners were asking for fair adjustments, and the HOA's panic was now visible to everyone. But he remained calm, patient, and measured, knowing that the final outcomes would take time. His focus was on stewardship, fairness, and long-term clarity. It became clear to him that this experience wasn't just about land or ownership. It was about honesty, patience, and the courage to confront misinformation without malice. The survey had done more than mark boundaries. It had shifted the community's understanding, exposed a system that relied on fear and assumption. As he stood near the edge of his property at sunset, watching shadows stretch across the fields, he reflected on the journey. The inheritance had seemed like a simple gift at first. Instead, it had become a lesson in persistence, truth, and responsibility. And he knew that the final chapter, the resolution of the HOA's overreach and the community's adjustment, was just around the corner. After weeks of quiet observation, careful documentation, and patient communication, the situation reached a turning point. The survey had made it clear every stake, every measurement, every corner of the land was officially his. The HOA could no longer rely on assumptions, rumors, or outdated maps. Their authority over his land had evaporated. It started with small changes. Some of the more level-headed board members quietly admitted they had overstepped. They stopped sending threatening letters and began consulting attorneys to understand the legal reality. Their attempts to regain control were slow, cautious, and largely ineffective. Homeowners, now armed with facts from the survey, began to speak up. Conversations that had once been hushed whispers at community gatherings became open discussions. People asked questions about fees they had paid, about access they had been denied, and about past claims that no longer held legal weight. He attended one of these gatherings, not to confront anyone, but to offer clarity. His presence was calm, measured. He laid out the facts, the survey results, the legal documents confirming inheritance, and the clear property lines. Some homeowners listened in disbelief. Others nodded slowly, the truth finally settling in after years of misinformation. One elderly man, who had lived near the property for decades, approached him after the meeting. "I should have questioned things sooner," he said quietly. "We just trusted the HOA. We didn't know any better." He shook his head. "You're not alone. Many people assumed the same thing. What matters now is that everyone understands the truth and can move forward." The HOA leadership was visibly shaken. Meetings became tense. Arguments grew heated, and private discussions revealed panic. Some board members considered resigning, recognizing that their credibility had collapsed. Others tried to salvage authority by proposing compromises, offering limited access or minor concessions, but these gestures were too little too late. The survey had made it clear they had no legal claim over the land. Meanwhile, homeowners continued to adjust. Some asked for refunds for fees that had been wrongly collected. Others sought confirmation of their own property boundaries, now more aware of the importance of verifying claims. The community slowly began to rebuild trust not in the HOA, but in transparency and documented truth. He remained patient throughout. He didn't pursue revenge or try to humiliate anyone. Instead, he focused on fairness, clarity, and long-term stewardship. He walked the property regularly, checking boundaries, documenting access points, and ensuring that the land remained secure. Each visit reminded him that ownership was not just about legal rights, it was about responsibility. Over time, HOA's presence in the disputed areas faded. Signs were removed, fences adjusted, and access points clarified. The aggressive leader, who had once been the loudest voice against him, eventually resigned, frustrated and exposed. Legal professionals began processing refunds and clarifications for homeowners who had been misled. The community, once divided by fear and misinformation, slowly stabilized. Neighbors began to approach him for advice. Some asked how to protect their own property, while others simply wanted to understand the boundaries of the inherited land. He answered patiently, showing maps and survey results. His calm, factual approach earned respect. People realized that confrontation wasn't necessary when truth and evidence were on your side. One afternoon, a family approached him as he walked along a trail near the forested edge of the property. They had once believed that area belonged to the HOA and had avoided it out of fear of fines or reprimand. Now, seeing the survey stakes and the clear markings, they smiled in relief. "We didn't know this was yours," the father said. "We've been cautious for years. It's a relief to finally know." He nodded. "It's important to understand the truth. Now that it's clear, you can enjoy the space without worry." That's the goal. By the end of the next few weeks, the final pieces fell into place. The HOA formally acknowledged the boundaries, though quietly and without fanfare. Homeowners who had paid fees for land they didn't own received refunds or credits. The aggressive board members stepped down, and the remaining leadership focused on legitimate community concerns. Leaving the inherited land free from false claims, he realized that the entire ordeal had taught a larger lesson, not just about land or ownership, but about power, trust, and patience. The HOA had relied on fear, misinformation, and unchallenged authority for years. Once those assumptions were questioned with facts and calm persistence, their power crumbled. It was a reminder that clarity, truth, and patience are stronger than anger or intimidation. The land itself became a symbol of that clarity. Forests, fields, and old dirt roads stretched wide and uninterrupted. Trails that had once been hidden behind false claims now opened for exploration. He started small improvements, not for profit, but to preserve the land's natural beauty. He mowed some paths, marked trails, and maintained areas near the houses to prevent misunderstandings in the future. Neighbors slowly grew comfortable with the new reality. They respected the boundaries, enjoyed shared access where appropriate, and began appreciating the space rather than fearing it. Some even thanked him personally for handling the situation calmly and fairly. His approach, measured, patient, and focused on documentation rather than conflict, had earned their trust.